Welcome to this online lesson on how were European countries ruled in the 1780s. Have a look at the map of Europe first of all. You might well notice some differences from how the map of Europe looks today. Well, that just shows you that even though the landmass doesn't change, the countries and who rules where, that can change very dramatically. So the aims of this lesson are to explore how Europe was ruled in the 18th century and to assess Louis XVI's style of rule and to interpret source material. Now, we should have already done a bit of work on Louis XVI and have a pretty good idea of what sort of king he was, and that sort of knowledge will be necessary to succeed with this lesson. Not only that, you may well have done some work on the estate system within France. Well, all of that together is going to be brought together now, and we're going to make some comparisons to other countries in Europe at the same time. So without further ado, we're going to start by interpreting a source. This is going to be a bit of a spoiler for what happens later on in this topic. I hope you've got a strong stomach. Have a look at this source. What can we infer from this picture? Now, when historians infer, it means that they're taking information that isn't immediately obvious. So let's go through the obvious things ourselves. What we can see is a man has had his head cut off. Now, I hate to tell you, that means he's probably dead. Alright, that's obvious, isn't it? But we might be able to see that. We might even be able to see how he's been killed. Do we know what the name of that device is? Alright. Can we see any other important people in the picture? Well, there appears to be a man wearing black. He's probably a priest. And there seems to be some soldiers down by the stage. We can see their guns and bayonets pointing up into the sky. So those are all reasonably obvious points, but they're not inferences. Historians make inferences by taking it beyond the obvious. And that's what I'd like you to do now. Try to think of at least one inference, something that's a bit of an educated guess and not obvious, that you can make from this source. Pause the video while you do that. Okay, what did we come up with? Well, first of all, you might have inferred that the person who's getting killed has committed a crime, but that they also might be quite an important person. Why is this an inference? Well, why would they be recording in so much detail the death of someone who wasn't at all important? You might also be making that inference given some of the people that we've studied so far. Another inference you might make is that there is a crowd watching and that perhaps they might have fought back and that's why they've got soldiers there. So the soldiers are partly there to keep order. You might have made the inference that this person was religious and that's why there's a priest present. By the way, did you identify the device that's done the killing? It's called a guillotine, and believe it or not, it was invented as a more humane way of beheading people. It's more reliable than an axe and certainly quicker. But here's a grisly fact for you. Sometimes it was so quick that we think the people who were beheaded with it were still alive for a few seconds later until the blood drained out of their head and they could see what was going on. That's one heck of a thought, isn't it? I think it's time we moved on to something a little bit less grisly. What is a revolution? Well, we're studying the French Revolution at the moment, so it's important to understand this term and a few others too. Think about one meaning of the term revolution. A revolution is one whole turn, and when a wheel has gone all the way round, it has made one revolution. Sometimes history too seems to turn around and go in a different way. Historians call these revolutions. They tend to be big changes that are happening relatively quickly. Now, in the whole context of history, a revolution might take 100 years. But if it's a big enough change, that can still be considered a revolution. The Industrial Revolution would be a good example of this. On the other hand, the revolution might happen in a single day or just within a few weeks or months. This is another form of revolution. The French Revolution is one that lasts for a few years, but there are many really big changes that happen within days and months. So let's have a look at some key terms related to this. Cloak's compendium of annoying old-fashioned words that you need to know today comprises of revolution, when something changes in a big way, comparatively quickly. Monarchy, ruled by a monarch, also by a king and queen, or king or queen. Mono means one, so monarchy means rule by one. Think of other words as well, like hierarchy, that's rule by levels. Absolute monarchy, where the monarch has all the power. Constitutional monarchy, where the monarch rules, but only with the permission of the government. Your tasks then. Record the terms and their meanings. Secondly, which of these keywords relate to Britain's government today? Give that some thought and pause the video while you complete the tasks. So which words do apply to Britain today? Are we going for a revolution? Well, probably not. There's been big challenges in the country lately, but after it's all dealt with, it'll probably go back to pretty much how it was before. What about a monarchy? Do we have one of those? Well, yes, we do. We've got a queen, haven't we? What about an absolute monarchy? Does the queen tell everyone what to do? Well, actually, no, not really. So what about a constitutional monarchy? Does the queen rule with the permission of the people? Well, that's probably the best description we've got. After all, the Queen passes all of our laws, and they're decided by Parliament, but she's not allowed to decide those laws for herself. She's also not allowed to say no to passing those laws. She's just got to do it. So, in effect, we have a constitutional monarchy in Britain today. But Europe in the 1780s was very different, so let's get some examples. Europe in the 1780s. There's that funny map again. Look, there's all sorts of countries on there that you might not recognise, and some that you do. So the first thing I'd like you to do is to list the countries that you do recognise, and then list the ones that you do not recognise. Study the map and complete the task now. So pause the video. Okay, I would expect that most of you will have recognised the following countries. Great Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands probably, though you might have heard it called Holland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Poland, Austria, and Russia. There are some pretty big players missing here, aren't there? Where's Germany? Where's Italy? And there are others too. Okay, well, let's consider some of the countries that I expect you haven't heard of. The Holy Roman Empire. Wow, that sounds a bit serious. Venice. Well, you might have heard of Venice as a city, but not as a country. The Papal States. Well, they sort of still exist. You might have heard of the Vatican City. That's kind of the last remnant of the Papal States. It's ruled by the Pope, that's what that means. Prussia. No, you didn't read that wrong, and it's not a typo. There was a place called Prussia. You might have heard of Lithuania as well, but Poland, Lithuania? They're not the same country anymore. Alright, the last one you might not have recognised is the Ottoman Empire. That's a big empire, but today we kind of call that region Turkey. Although the Ottoman Empire ruled a much bigger region than what we now call Turkey, as you can see. It includes places like Greece. But this is a history lesson rather than a geography lesson, so we're going to try and learn a little bit about how these places were ruled. Your tasks are: you're going to have to try and find your own copy of this map, or if you're unable to do that, try and draw one of your own. I've included in the link to this, in the description of this video rather, a link to a suitable map. You can then add notes and labels from this table to explain who ran each country. Then, as an extension, which countries seem to be most similar in terms of how they are ruled. So the big players that I've chosen for us to look at in more detail are the following. France. This was ruled by Louis XVI in 1780. There was no parliament in this country, and he ran the country on his own and became very unpopular. Then there's Prussia. Not Russia, Prussia. This was ruled by Frederick the Great. He too ran the country with no parliament. He fought many wars and made Prussia very powerful. That meant that he was actually really popular with his people. Then we've got the Habsburg Empire. This is what is labelled as Austria, but notice that Austria actually controls other little bits as well, like modern-day Belgium and part of northern Italy. The Habsburg Empire was ruled by Joseph II, again without a parliament. Many people did not like the way he ruled. Russia was ruled by Catherine the Great. She ruled without a parliament too. Peasants were treated badly, and the people often rebelled against her. Lastly, we have Great Britain, ruled by King George III. He shared power with Parliament, but Britain was rich and powerful. It had a strong navy at this time, and an empire was growing in India and Africa. So pause the video now and complete those tasks. Press play when you're ready to continue. Hopefully you've been able to label those countries correctly. So which seem most similar? Well, you may have noticed that France, Prussia, the Habsburg Empire and Russia are all run in a similar way, without a parliament. But some of them seem to be doing better than others. Both France and Russia and the Habsburg Empire, are ruled by people who do not like their ruling king. So probably France, the Habsburg Empire and Russia have got some of the main things in common. What about absolute monarchs? Here is King Louis XVI of France. We've already done some work on him, so you've probably got some ideas about what his rule was like and what sort of a man he was. I'm now going to do my impression of Louis XVI, which involves me doing a French accent. I'm afraid it's been inspired by the comedians at Monty Python, and if you don't know who Monty Python are, I suggest you ask your parents. Anyway, I apologise. I am an absolute monarch. I have the power to do whatever I like. I do not believe in sharing power with anyone. My power is given to me by God. Okay, let's record these statements about Louis XVI. And then I'm going to ask you, does that sound familiar? Does it sound like anyone else that you might have studied? Pause the video, give that some thought, and then we'll consider it. Okay, hopefully by this point you're over my terrible and, let's face it, almost offensive French accent. So who might that sound a little bit like? Did it sound a bit like this chap? Well, there's a reason why he's saying don't lose your head, Louis. That's Charles I, who indeed did lose his head at the end of the English Civil War. So what are the similarities? Was Charles I an absolute monarch? Well, he was. He wouldn't share his power with Parliament, and that's why the war started. Did he believe in sharing power with anyone? Nope, not at all. In fact, when Parliament got a little bit too big for its boots, in Charles's view, he booted them out for 10 years. And then he also believed in something called the divine right of kings, the idea that his power was given to him by God. So there are some similarities between Louis XVI and Charles I of England. The difference is, though, that Louis XVI was living over 100 years after Charles I had died. So whereas England had been through its arguable revolution during the English Civil War, if people were unhappy with Louis, they hadn't yet worked out a way of controlling him. That was to prove fatal for him. That picture you saw at the start of the man who had been beheaded was Louis. So, over to you. Based upon your findings from the last task, you can write the following answers in your books on paper or on a word processor, or however you're trying to do this. Maybe not writing on a wall. Which is the only country not to be ruled by an absolute monarch? Explain why, and think about it. And also think about what else we've studied so far which might explain it. Secondly, what do you think it was like to live in Europe at this time in 1780 for a rich person or a poor person? It has to be said that in most countries the experience would have been pretty similar. And lastly, what might explain why rich and poor people in Europe had such a different experience? Pause the video now, and then when you're ready, press play and we'll move on. Well, we should have identified that Great Britain was the only country not ruled by an absolute monarch, and the reason for it was the English Civil War. After all, King Charles I had had his head cut off, and when King Charles II was invited to take over and bring back the monarchy, he had to do so with the consent of Parliament and obey certain rules. So by this point, although you can't truly say that Great Britain was a democracy, because so few people had the vote, it was on the path to becoming a democratic society. So what would it have been like to live in Europe for a rich person? Well, probably pretty good, as long as you kept on the side of the king. The trouble was, if the king was really ineffective, or the queen in the case of Russia, then you might not get on so well. And also consider the issue of Russian rebellions. That might put the rich in some danger, but for the most part they would have felt both secure and comfortable, and they would have felt most of all very powerful. But what about poor people? Well, virtually no poor people in Europe at this time had any say whatsoever in how the country was run. They didn't have the vote, and even if they did have the vote, most of them didn't have a government that they could actually vote for. Notice that only Britain was a country that ruled with a parliament like the one we have today, and even Britain's parliament was only answerable to the very rich. So what might explain why rich and poor people had such different experiences? Well, really it's this difference in power. Who had a say and who could communicate directly with the monarch who was going to make all those decisions, and who had no say and just basically had to get on with it. But not everyone was happy with that. Sometimes the changes and the amount of power that poorer people got in societies happened very slowly. Other times they happened very quickly, in a revolution. So how equal was France? Have a look at this picture in the top right. It's quite a famous illustration, this. What do you see? Okay, who thinks they saw an old lady? You can see there she's got a big bumpy nose, a big pointy chin, and a bit of a scowl on her face. On the other hand, who saw a young woman? Instead of a big bumpy nose, that's the side of her face. and you can see her jawline. What was the old lady's eye is now her ear, and what was that scowling face is just a little necklace round her neck. The point here is that this is really a matter of interpretations, but it actually relates to a story I'm about to tell you as well. In 1787, an Englishman called Arthur Young went to France. He thought it was very dirty and a very poor place. One day he met a poor woman. She looked about 70 years old, according to Arthur Young, and she told him that France was a sad country. Why? Asked Arthur. Well, the woman told him that she had 1 cow and 7 children, yet she paid rent to 2 landlords as well as taxes to the government. So she was incredibly poor and she didn't really know how to make ends meet. Arthur asked how old she was, and she replied, 28. Wow, he thought that she was 70. She must have lived a heck of a hard life. The poor people were very poor, is what he wrote. Now let's just pull this source apart just for a moment. I do wonder if Arthur was rather exaggerating when he said he thought that this woman was 70, but clearly he thought that she had had a very hard life indeed. And remember as well, Arthur Young being an Englishman might not have had the best opinion of the French. After all, England and France have been to war several times in the previous century. Lastly, something else to bear in mind is that Arthur Young would have been a rich man. Well, how do I know this? Well, back then, you didn't really get tourists in the same way as we do now. If you were a tourist travelling around France, you had a lot of money because you did not have to work. Therefore, Arthur Young is doing this from the point of view of an Englishman, and a rich Englishman at that. But what strikes me as interesting is that Arthur Young would have been familiar with how poor people were in England too. And here he's saying the poor people of France are very poor. So that's very poor even in comparison to the poor of England, which must have meant that they were truly desperate. Well, part of the explanation why is explained by this diagram. For some of you who've encountered the estates of France before, you can consider this revision. For others, this might be brand new information. So at the top of French government we have got the king, but he's only the first in a sort of hierarchy. So at the top is the king. He's the most powerful of all, he's the absolute monarch, and of course his name at this time is Louis XVI. Then we have the first estate. The first estate pays no tax whatsoever, and it consists of about 130,000 priests, bishops and abbots. Then we've got the second estate. They pay no tax either. They have to do a few jobs though, like being army officers, but other than that, they're the nobility. They might advise the king, or they might just be landlords who take rent. There's about 400,000 of these, and they're mostly barons, dukes and counts. Lastly, there's the third estate. That's everybody else. So obviously my triangle here is not at all in proportion to the reality. So if that's everybody else, well, we've got one man, the king at the top, 130,000 priests, bishops and abbots who are part of the church, 400,000 barons, dukes and counts who might be in charge of the army but are probably just big landowners, and 25 million of everyone else. So that doesn't necessarily mean they're all poor. There would have been teachers, lawyers, merchants, people with shops, and of course the peasants. These are the farmers who had to farm the land and grow the food. So copy this diagram in your books and then describe what this diagram shows about how France was ruled. Lastly, ask yourself this question. Is this fair? Whatever your point of view, explain your answer. Pause the video now while you complete these tasks. So hopefully we've identified that there is a lot of inequality in France at this time. So the 25 million people down the bottom have to pay all of the tax, despite the fact that they're not the richest people. Now, some of these people would have been quite able to afford these taxes, so fair enough. Others, though, like the peasants and many others, would not have had the money to hardly support themselves, let alone pay tax on top of that. The idea was that the barons, dukes and counts were supposed to defend the country, and that's what they got out of this situation. That was the work that they did. Although by this point, people didn't really behave in that sort of way. That's more of a medieval idea. The other thing is that the priests, the bishops and the abbots were supposed to save everybody's soul. Well, again, those ideas were being challenged by what was called the Enlightenment too, and people were starting to turn more towards science. Ultimately, this is a really outdated system of government and an outdated way of organising your society. And it's a way of organising society that in Britain by this point had been gone for well over 100 years. That's not to say that Britain was a particularly equal society at this time. It absolutely was not. But compared to this, it was further on down in terms of being more equal than the French had got. And so ultimately, whatever your opinion was, most of those 25 million teachers, lawyers, peasants and everybody else were absolutely sick of this system, and they did not find it fair at all. Let's have a look at this picture again. You may have seen it before. This cartoon was produced in France during the reign of Louis XVI. It was given the title, The People under the Ancien Régime. Now, the Ancien Régime was the kind of family rule of Louis XVI and his dad Louis XV and his granddad Louis XIV and so forth. So let's interpret this source properly. Firstly, describe who the figures represent. Then give a detail from the source that shows how you know this. Identify the king, and the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. When you've done this, do you agree with this artist's opinion about Louis's reign? Well, that will also rely on you actually working out what that opinion is, so make sure you note down that too. Pause the video now. Done? Well, let's see. Firstly, the king is in the blue jacket with a star on it, holding a whip. I realise that whip might look like he's a bit like he's holding a leek, but it's not. It's actually a whip. So how do we know that that's the king? Well, first of all, it looks like him. Second of all, we can tell that he's rich. Third of all, he's fat, and that's something that we might know about the king at this time. But lastly, look how he's commanding the person at the bottom. He's digging in with his spurs as a punishment, and you can see the blood pouring out. He's got reins attached around his head, so he's directing where he's going to go. And he's got a whip to punish him if he does anything wrong. Those are all things that a king at this time might do. What about the first estate? Well, we might realise that the first estate is all people who work for the church. There's only one person on there who looks like he's dressed like somebody who works for the church, and it's the man in the bishop's hat. He's in the middle. And then we've got the nobility at the top, wearing his posh robes and wig. That's a member of the second estate. We can see that he's holding a copy of the laws. Lastly, the third estate is down the bottom, very much as it would be in the diagram we did earlier. Notice that he's skinny and thin and suffering. He's also being told what to do, and he's blindfolded so he can't see where he's going. And perhaps most tellingly, he's got chains around his legs and around his arms, much as a slave would do. So that's not giving a particularly nice view of what it was like to be in the third estate at this time. So really, the artist's interpretation here is that the third estate is being treated unfairly and having to metaphorically carry the first, second estates and the king. Meanwhile, while he's doing all the work, they get a free ride. So do you agree with this artist's opinion about Louis's reign? Well, I expect most of you probably will do, but hopefully you'll be able to back it up with examples about how Louis ruled his country. Possibly you'll be able to give a specific example from previous knowledge that you've got about Louis's reign. If you haven't backed up your answer very well, now's a good chance to pause the video and do that. When you're ready, let's move on to our last task. Finally, imagine you are a literate member of the third estate. That means someone who knew how to read and write. Picture the scene. It's the dead of night, you have a pot of paint, and you're going to make a stand. What graffiti would you write on Louis's Bastille prison war in Paris? The Bastille, by the way, was an evil castle that people thought was very, very nasty. You need to work quickly, but you must include one unfair thing about your life and one reason that you don't like Louis. Now, before you all go away and say that Mr. Cloak's been telling us to go and graffiti walls, that's not it at all. One of the points we're making, though, is that at this time, some people did start to make challenges to Louis's rule. And one of the ways they did this was by graffitiing and vandalising things that they associated with Louis's rule. And one of those things in Paris was the building called the Bastille. But more on that in a future lesson. For now, complete that last task, get some last thoughts down, and that will be the end of the lesson. So, once you've done that task, I'll say thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed the video and found it useful, there will be more coming, and if you're able to like this video or subscribe to the channel, then please do so. If you're not, just thanks for watching and taking part. Until next time, goodbye.